close your eyes and imagine the air of Europe in the 9th century, thick with wood smoke. The ring of iron and the quiet hum of Latin prayers echoing from candlelit chapels. Somewhere between ruin and rebirth, a land without clear borders begins to take shape. They will one day call it Germany, but in this moment it is only a shadow of something larger in air to a vanished empire. When Charlemagne died in 814, his world fractured like glass beneath a great weight. His empire once stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe splintered among grandsons and rivals, each clutching their own vision of order. The Carolingian dream, shimmering like light on a sword's edge, began to fade. Yet from that collapse came something strange, something newer, kingdom rising from ashes and uncertainty. The monks wrote of it in cautious Latin. The warriors felt it in their bones. The peasants simply saw new lords, new banners, and a cross raised above every village. The people did not yet know they were living through the birth of a nation that would one day command both faith and fear across all of Europe. The kings who ruled these lands, Louis the German, his sons, and his grandsons found themselves presiding over something they barely understood. A realm held together not by language or law, but by a fragile idea that the people of the East Franks, Saxons, Bavarians were bound by duty to a single crown, a single cross, and a memory of greatness long gone. In those early centuries, the forests were vast and untamed. Wolves roamed where cities now stand. Monks travelled with armed escorts through lands where the old gods were still whispered to beneath the trees. Every sermon, every sword, every stone laid in a monastery wall was an act of defiance against chaos. And in that defiance, something began to stir. Empire's ghost reaching for life again. As the bells of Aachen fell silent and the frontier burned, a new power was already forming in the east, where kings would soon rise not as heirs to Rome, but as builders of their own destiny. What began as fragments of the Carolingian dream would, in time, become the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. But for now, it was still only a whisper in the woods, carried by wind and iron, promising a story that was only beginning. From the ashes of Charlemagne's empire, the East Frankish kingdom emerged, realm of uncertain borders and restless hearts. It was not yet the Germany we know, but a mosaic of tribes, customs, and loyalties bound together by the uneasy hand of kingship. Imagine the vast landscapes stretching from the Rhine to the Elbe, forests so thick that even the sunlight seemed reluctant to enter, rivers gliding like mirrors beneath the heavy mist of dawn. It was here that Louis the German began to shape his dominion, ruling not as emperor, but as a king among shifting loyalties. His court, half sacred and half savage, balanced between the Latin world of monks and the warrior traditions of the pagan frontier. The monasteries wrote chronicles of salvation and order, while beyond their walls, warlords and tribal chieftains carved out small kingdoms of their own. The air carried the scent of pine and blood of iron striking iron, of oaths sworn by candlelight. Every alliance was fragile, every peace a heartbeat away from war. Yet beneath this uncertainty, a pattern began to form. The Saxons, once defiant and wild, were drawn into the king's service, their sons baptized and sworn to Christ. The Bavarians, with their mountain strongholds, became the backbone of royal armies. The Swabians, the Franks, the Thuringians all were slowly woven into a tapestry that would stretch across centuries. The church was the invisible architect of this unity. Bishops became princes, abbots became diplomats, and cathedrals rose like islands of light amid the darkness of the age. Scriptoria hummed with the copying of sacred texts, and every word inked upon parchment became a thread in the fabric of civilization. But even as the light of faith spread, shadows deepened at the edges. The Northmen came with their dragon-headed ships, searing coasts and river valleys. The Magyars thundered in from the east, swift and merciless, their raids turning villages to ash. And within the kingdom itself, the sons of Louis fought each other for power, their greed fracturing what little unity had been achieved. Yet history often moves in cycles of destruction and renewal, and from this turbulence arose a new kind of ruler-king, forged by necessity, tempered by invasion, and guided by faith. His name was Otto, and he would become the architect of a dream long thought dead. The dream of an empire reborn not from Rome, but from the heart of Germany itself. By the 10th century, the East had hardened into a land of iron and prayer, and among its restless kings, one would rise higher than the rest. Otto of Saxony, known to history as Otto the Great, was not merely a ruler, but a builder of order in a time when chaos seemed eternal. He inherited a kingdom that was more fragile alliance than nation, a patchwork of dukes, bishops, and warriors bound by loyalty only when it suited their ambition. Yet Otto understood something few before him had grasped, that power, to last, must be both sacred and strategic. Imagine his coronation at Aachen in 936, the ancient capital of Charlemagne himself. Candles flickered in golden sconces as priests chanted the old Latin blessings, their voices rising into the vaulted air. The scent of incense mingled with the clatter of armor. Every gesture, every word was designed to echo Rome, to remind the lords gathered there that Otto was not merely their equal, but their emperor in waiting. Yet outside those stone walls, the world remained wild. Pagan Slavs resisted conversion beyond the Elbe. Hungarian raiders scorched the countryside, leaving burned villages in their wake, and rival nobles watched Otto's every move, waiting for weakness. But Otto was patient, methodical. He built his strength not only through war, but through faith. He placed his trust in the church, appointing bishops as administrators and warriors of the cross. In return, they gave him legitimacy, a divine right to rule that even the proudest duke could not easily challenge. When the Magyars returned in 955, sweeping across the plains with their deadly archers, Otto met them at the Lechfeld near Augsburg. The battle was brutal and decisive. Under a burning August sun, the German host stood firm, and when the dust cleared, the threat from the east was broken forever. That victory did more than secure Otto's realm, it gave birth to an empire. In its wake, the old dream of Rome flickered back to life. The chroniclers began to write once more of emperors, not kings. Otto's name carried across Europe, and when he crossed the Alps to Rome in 962 to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, the centuries seemed to fold upon themselves. The empire of faith and iron had returned, not as imitation, but as rebirth. Yet every empire casts a shadow, and Otto's triumph carried within it the seeds of struggle that would haunt the German world for generations. With Otto's coronation in Rome, the empire took on a new shape, a realm that was neither wholly Roman nor wholly German, but something suspended between heaven and earth. It was a union of crown and cross, of temporal power and divine sanction. The monks who chronicled the moment called it the rebirth of Christendom, yet to those who lived within it, it was less a rebirth and more a fragile balance, a dream balanced upon faith and fear. Otto saw the church not as a rival, but as the backbone of his rule. Bishops and abbots became his stewards, managing lands and issuing decrees where royal presence could not reach. The church's language became the empire's language, its rituals, the empire's rhythm. Cathedrals rose upon hilltops like stone prayers, their bells marking the hours of a people bound to both God and king. And yet, beneath the solemn hymns and the flicker of holy fire, ambition burned. The emperors who followed Otto would inherit not just his power, but his burden, the endless struggle to command a land too vast to be tamed, too holy to be ruled by the sword alone. The Pope in Rome and the Emperor in Germany stood as uneasy partners, each claiming to be the guardian of divine order. For a time, the balance held. The empire prospered under Otto's descendants, who built monasteries, reformed the clergy, and extended their influence deep into Italy. Trade routes opened along the Rhine and Danube, carrying silver, salt, and stories between kingdoms. Pilgrims walked from Cologne to Rome. Knights swore oaths beneath banners bearing the Black Eagle, and peasants tilled fields that now belonged not to lords, but to God's representatives on earth. Yet even as the empire glittered in its new unity, cracks began to show. The bishops, once loyal to their emperor, grew rich and powerful. Dukes resented the king's reliance on the clergy, and within the walls of Rome, whispers began to stir. No emperor, no matter how anointed, could stand above the will of the Church. The Holy Roman Empire, born from faith, now found itself shadowed by pride. The question lingered like smoke after a battle. Who truly held the keys to Christendom? The man who wore the crown, or the man who blessed it? The answer would come not in peace, but in conflict, as empire and papacy prepared to test the limits of their divine right. By the 11th century, the empire's golden harmony began to dim beneath the weight of ambition and sanctity. The alliance between the crown and the cross, once Otto's greatest triumph, had become a slow, simmering struggle for dominance. The emperors ruled with the belief that their power came directly from God, but the popes in Rome began to speak with a new confidence, a dangerous conviction that no king should command the Church of Christ. It began with whispers, then letters, then open defiance. The Gregorian reform, led by Pope Gregory VII, struck at the very foundation of imperial power. The Church sought to free itself from worldly control, to appoint its own bishops and priests without the emperor's interference. But in Germany, the emperor's authority rested upon these same bishops, men who ruled lands, commanded armies, and swore fealty to him as vassals. To lose them was to lose the empire itself. And so, when Emperor Henry IV defied the Pope's decree, the stage was set for one of history's most haunting confrontations. Imagine the winter of 1077 in the frozen passes of the Alps, snow falling like ash upon stone. A king stripped of his crown and pride, barefoot and cloaked in wool, walking the road to Canossa. For 3 days, Henry stood in the snow outside the castle of Matilda of Tuscany, waiting for the Pope to lift his excommunication. The chroniclers called it penance, but it was more than that. It was submission. The Emperor of the Germans, heir to Charlemagne and Otto, stood as a penitent before the Vicar of God. When the gates finally opened and the Pope received him, history trembled. From that moment on, the empire would never again stand above the Church. Yet even in humiliation, Henry's defiance did not die. When he returned to Germany, he gathered his armies and marched again, crowning his own pope and seizing Rome in flames of vengeance. The investiture controversy, as later ages would name, it tore Europe between sacred and secular power, shattering the illusion of unity that had defined the Holy Roman world. Kings and popes would continue their dance for centuries, each claiming to rule by divine right, each haunted by the other's shadow. And through it all, the people, the monks, the soldiers, the peasants could only pray that somewhere between the crown and the cross, order would find them again. When the quarrel between the Pope and the Emperor finally cooled, it left behind a kingdom splintered not by conquest, but by pride. The 12th century dawned not upon a united empire, but upon 1,000 small worlds, each with its own laws, towers, and banners fluttering in the wind. The dream of a single German order, one crown beneath one god, had dissolved into a map of feudal fiefdoms, where dukes, bishops, and city lords ruled as little kings in all but name. Imagine the landscape then, castles perched upon crags like sleeping beasts, surrounded by villages clinging to their protection. Cathedrals rising beside rivers whose names carried stories older than memory. Markets crowded with merchants speaking a dozen dialects of the same tongue. Each valley had its own rhythm, its own loyalty, its own faith in the protection of local saints and lords. The emperor, once master of both altar and sword, now wandered between these lands as a symbol more than a sovereign, seeking to command where his voice could scarcely be heard. And yet, in this fragmentation, something unexpected began to grow. The towns, those small clusters of traders and craftsmen, began to thrive in the spaces between noble rivalries. Freed from the rigid hierarchies of the countryside, they built walls, councils, and markets that became engines of new wealth. In cities like Nuremberg, Cologne, and Lübeck, guilds replaced swords as the instruments of power, and gold began to rival land as the measure of worth. Trade routes stitched the empire together more effectively than armies ever could. Silver from Saxony, salt from Lüneburg, furs from the Baltikich, flowed along rivers and roads that ignored the borders drawn by men. The Hanseatic League, a brotherhood of merchant cities, rose quietly along the northern coast, weaving prosperity through cooperation while princes still quarreled over titles and tithes. But freedom was a fragile thing in a world still ruled by faith and feud. As cities grew rich, they attracted envy. As bishops lost ground, they sought new forms of control. The empire had survived the wrath of popes and the pride of kings, but now it faced something more elusively, the struggle to define itself amid the rising power of its own people. From this chaos would come new dynasties, new dreams, and the slow, uneasy birth of the medieval German soul. When the quarrel between the Pope and the Emperor finally cooled, it left behind a kingdom splintered not by conquest, but by pride. The 12th century dawned not upon a united empire, but upon 1,000 small worlds, towers, and banners fluttering in the wind. The dream of a single German order, one crown beneath one god, had dissolved into a map of feudal fiefdoms where dukes, bishops, and city lords ruled as little kings in all but name. Imagine the landscape then. Castles perched upon crags like sleeping beasts, surrounded by villagers clinging to their protection. Cathedrals rising beside rivers whose names carried stories older than memory. Markets crowded with merchants speaking a dozen dialects of the same tongue. Each valley had its own rhythm, its own loyalty, its own faith in the protection of local saints and lords. The emperor, once master of both altar and sword, now wandered between these lands as a symbol more than a sovereign, seeking to command where his voice could scarcely be heard. And yet, in this fragmentation, something unexpected began to grow. The towns, those small clusters of traders and craftsmen, began to thrive in the spaces between noble rivalries. Freed from the rigid hierarchies of the countryside, they built walls, councils, and markets that became engines of new wealth. In cities like Nuremberg, Cologne, and Lübeck, guilds replaced swords as the instruments of power, and gold began to rival land as the measure of worth. Trade routes stitched the empire together more effectively than armies ever could. Silver from Saxony, salt from Lüneburg, furs from the Baltic flowed along rivers and roads that ignored the borders drawn by men. The Hanseatic League, a brotherhood of merchant cities, rose quietly along the northern coast, weaving prosperity through cooperation while princes still quarreled over titles and tithes. But freedom was a fragile thing in a world still ruled by faith and feud. As cities grew rich, they attracted envy. As bishops lost ground, they sought new forms of control. The empire had survived the wrath of popes and the pride of kings, but now it faced something more elusively, the struggle to define itself amid the rising power of its own people. From this chaos would come new dynasties, new dreams, and the slow, uneasy birth of the medieval German soul. Out of the fractured realm emerged a dynasty both cunning and ambitious. Their name carried the weight of storms, their emblem the promise of renewal, yet their reign would become one of light and shadow. Conrad III was the first of their line to grasp the imperial crown, but it was his nephew, Frederick Barbarossa, who would give the empire its most enduring legend. His very name, Barbarossa, the red beard goad through taverns, courts, and cloisters alike, spoken with awe and dread. He envisioned an empire restored to its old grandeur, a realm where emperor and law stood above the chaos of dukes and bishops. When he rode, his armies glittered like the scales of a serpent, banners snapping in the wind, priests chanting beneath the clang of armor. To his subjects, he was both king and myth, a living symbol of divine order. Barbarossa sought not only to rule, but to be remembered. He codified laws, strengthened cities, and tried to bind the empire with reason as much as with fear. Yet his dream of unity collided with the will of others, the proud Lombard cities to the south, the watchful popes in Rome, the restless nobles who guarded their autonomy like gold. The clash between empire and Italy became a war of pride and endurance. At the Battle of Legnano in 1176, the emperor's might met the defiance of free men. As his army broke upon the Italian spears, the myth began to crack. Barbarossa retreated, wounded in spirit but not yet defeated, and the years that followed turned his ambition inward. He became the Travelecking, moving from court to court, holding diets and councils, seeking order in a land that resisted every chain. Yet even his defeats fed his legend, when he drowned suddenly in 1190 while crossing a river on crusade. His men could scarcely believe he was dead. Some said the emperor had not perished, but slept beneath a mountain, his red beard growing through the stone, waiting to return when Germany needed him most. The story lingered in every age a hope that somewhere in the heart of the mountains, the Emperor of Shadows still waited, ready to rise again and restore what was lost. After Barbarossa's body sank beneath the waters of the Salif River, his legacy did not vanish, smoldered. His grandson, Frederick II, born of German and Norman blood, would become both the fulfillment and the undoing of the imperial dream. They called him Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, the scholar, poet, warrior, and heretic all at once. He spoke half a dozen languages, kept falcons and philosophers at his court, and dared to question the church that crowned him. To some, he was the Antichrist. To others, a modern mind trapped in medieval chains. When he ruled from his sun-drenched palace in Sicily, the empire seemed to tilt southward, its northern heartlands murmuring under foreign governance. Yet Frederick's ambition was limitless. He sought to tame Italy, to bring law where there was rebellion, to balance faith with reason. But the papacy would not yield. Popes called crusades against him, branding the emperor himself as an enemy of Christ. Cities turned on cities, noble houses tore their banners apart, and the Holy Roman Empire, once envisioned as the earthly mirror of divine order, split into factions and feuds. Frederick's reign shimmered with brilliance, yet carried the scent of decay. His court at Palermo glowed with learning. Astronomers mapped the heavens, physicians studied the body, and poets sang of both love and logic. Yet outside his walls, Germany descended into chaos. Princes ruled their own territories with growing arrogance, minting their own coins, waging their own wars. The emperor's long absences created a vacuum that no law could fill. When Frederick II died in 1250, his passing was not a thunderclap, but a slow dimming of light. Chroniclers wrote of omens, the sun darkening, stars vanishing, while others claimed his body vanished entirely, carried away by unseen forces. In the streets and forests of Germany, people whispered that another Frederick, like his grandfather, had merely gone to sleep, waiting for the empire to be made whole again. But no such awakening came. Instead, the empire entered its twilight, the great interregnum time, without a ruler. When crowns passed like drifting ash and no voice spoke for all of Germany. Yet even in its disarray, the idea of empire lingered, that beyond the ruins, beyond the silence, something vast and ancient still remembered the Red Emperor's name when Frederick II's bones turned to dust beneath the Sicilian earth. The Holy Roman Empire became a body without a head, a cathedral without its altar. From 1250 to 1273, there was no emperor, no supreme authority to bind the restless lords or sanctify the realm's law. It was called the Great Interregnum, a void stretched across a generation, a silence that thundered louder than war. Every duke, count, and bishop became his own monarch, minting coins with his face, raising armies for his cause, and bending justice to his will. The empire splintered into hundreds of fragments, each ruled by men who claimed divine right but served only ambition. Bandits roamed freely on roads once patrolled by imperial knights. Towns built walls higher than cathedrals to keep out not just invaders, but their own neighbors. The Pope in Rome watched with satisfaction as the once golden eagle of the empire tore itself apart. Two rival kings were chosen by different factions: Richard of Cornwall, an English prince who bought his crown with silver, and Alfonso of Castile, who ruled from afar and never set foot on German soil. Neither man commanded loyalty, only the illusion of it. The land had grown tired of empty thrones and hollow oaths. In the chaos, the merchants of cities like Lübeck, Nuremberg, and Hamburg began to rise. Trade replaced loyalty. Profit replaced faith. The Hanseatic League was born in this void, a new power woven from salt, timber, and coin. The church too seized its moment, tightening its grip, selling indulgences, and crowning itself as the only true arbiter between heaven and earth. Yet among the ruins of imperial unity, the ghost of Barbarossa still haunted the valleys and peaks. Tales spread that he had not died at all, but slumbered in a mountain of Thuringia, his red beard growing through a stone table as he dreamed of Germany's return to greatness. When ravens ceased to circle the mountain, the stories said he would awaken and restore the empire. Hope clung to that myth like ivy on a tomb. But reality was harsher. Kings rose and fell, cities burned and rebuilt, and the golden ideal of one empire under heaven faded into legend. It was not the end of the empire, but it was its long, shivering night before the dawn. From the ashes of the great interregnum came a man few had expected to rule. Rudolf of Habsburg was not born into the grandeur of emperors. He was a count from the quiet valleys of Switzerland, known more for his humility than for his might. Yet, in 1273, when the princes of the Holy Roman Empire gathered to choose a new king, their eyes turned toward him not because he was the most powerful, but because he was the least threatening. In a land weary of warlords and tyrants, Rudolf's calm, methodical presence felt like a bomb on open wounds. He rode with a modest retinue, bore no jeweled crown, and promised nothing but stability. But beneath his quiet demeanor lay a mind of iron. Rudolf understood what the others did not, that the empire could no longer be ruled by sword alone, but by alliances, marriages, and calculated mercy. His first act as king was not to conquer, but to reclaim the lands seized during the interregnum. By greedy nobles were taken back into imperial hands. He marched not with arrogance, but with purpose, restoring the old laws. The Landfrieden, the peace of the land that forbade private wars. His justice was swift but not cruel. To rebellious lords, he offered pardon in exchange for loyalty. To bandits and marauders, only the gallows. Slowly, the empire began to breathe again. Yet Rudolf's greatest triumph was not on the battlefield, but in bloodlines. Through clever unions, he bound his family to lands that would echo their name for centuries: Austria, Carinthia. In those fertile valleys, the Habsburg dynasty took root, its tendrils spreading silently through Europe's veins. Some called Rudolf lucky, others divinely chosen. But luck alone does not forge empires. Patience and vision do. He never claimed the title of Emperor. Rome's blessing was withheld, but he wore the weight of empire just the same. And though his reign was brief, it restored a kind of fragile dignity to a land long fractured. When he died in 1291, he left behind not chaos, but a legacy of order. A whisper that perhaps Germany could still unite not through conquest, but through endurance. The Habsburg name would become synonymous with crowns, marriages, and dominions that stretched beyond imagination. But it all began here, with a modest man on a weary throne, piecing together what centuries of pride had torn apart. After Rudolf's death, the Habsburgs did not vanish into obscurity. They multiplied, weaving themselves into the very fabric of European power like a spider spinning its web. Their armies were modest, their castles fewer than their rivals, but their strategy was unlike any seen before. Let others wage war, one Habsburg would later say. You, happy Austria, marry. It was through marriages that they conquered what swords could not. Austria became their cradle, the Danube their bloodstream, and from there they reached outward toward Bohemia, Hungary, Burgundy, Spain. Each marriage brought not love, but leverage. Each wedding feast, a silent treaty sealed beneath the glint of candlelight. By the 14th century, the Habsburgs had become the architects of dynastic destiny, their name whispered in courts from Prague to Paris. Yet this rise did not come without shadows. The empire they helped shape was not one of unity, but of entanglement. The Holy Roman Empire became a labyrinth of feudal rights, princely electors, and church decrees, a realm where no single man could claim absolute rule. The emperor was both king and servant, crowned by God but constrained by the princes who chose him. And so, The Habsburgs learned to balance between pope and emperor, between ambition and caution. The cities grew richer in this time, their guilds and merchants defying old feudal order. Lübeck's ships ruled the Baltic, while Nuremberg's craftsmen forged the tools of empire. The Hanseatic League flourished, trading salt, wool, and silver, forming an economic kingdom beyond the emperor's grasp. But beneath the prosperity, unease festered. The Black Death crept across the continent in the mid-14th century, a darkness no ruler could contain. Villages emptied, fields turned to dust, and church bells tolled until their sound became a kind of dirge for all Europe. The empire, once a symbol of divine order, looked fragile under the weight of so much death. Yet the Habsburgs endured, untouched in their mountain strongholds, waiting, watching. When the plague receded, they were there to pick up the broken pieces, to marry into what remained of power. Their rise was not meteoric, was glacial, inevitable, unstoppable. And though their reach would soon extend to the far edges of the known world, it was here, in the quiet aftermath of medieval ruin, that they perfected their art to rule not by the sword, but by bloodline, patience, and the slow turning of time itself. In 1356, under the reign of Emperor Charles IV, a single document changed the course of medieval Germany forever. It was called the Golden Bull, not for its subject, but for the golden seal that marked Eta. Shimmering emblem of authority meant to end centuries of confusion over who held the true power to crown an emperor. For centuries, the process of choosing a ruler had been chaos, a patchwork of politics, bribery, papal interference, and open war. Charles sought to bring order to that storm, to lay down the law of kingship once and for all. The Golden Bull declared that 7 men, the electors, would forever hold the sacred right to choose the king of the Romans, who would later be crowned emperor. 3 were churchmen, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and 4 were secular princes, the king of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Together, they formed a council of fate, deciding who would wear the imperial crown. It was a masterpiece of balance, but also of division. In granting such power to the electors, Charles had ensured that no emperor would ever again rise to high above them. The empire would remain forever fractured, 7 pillars supporting a roof that could never fully stand. Still, for a time, peace returned. Charles made Prague his capital, transforming it into a jewel of Gothic splendor. Cathedrals rose, universities were founded, and scholars began to speak of a German identity not bound by kings but by culture, faith, and craft. The emperor's court became a beacon of art and order in a Europe still trembling from plague and war. Yet beneath the marble and parchment, the old rivalries slept lightly. The princes grew rich and independent, guarding their privileges like dragons guarding hoards. The electors themselves became powers equal to kings. Their votes traded like gold, their loyalty shifting with the winds of ambition. The Golden Bull had not united the empire, it had codified its fragmentation. And while Charles IV believed he had crafted peace, he had instead built a mechanism of perpetual balance, a system that ensured the empire would endure, not through strength, but through the delicate dance of compromise. It was a brilliance and a curse intertwined, one that would echo for centuries, keeping Germany powerful in spirit but divided in soul, as emperors and princes played their eternal chess game. A different kind of power began to rise, not from thrones or castles, but from markets, docks, and cobbled streets. The free imperial cities of medieval Germany became living testaments to self-determination, each a world unto itself, governed not by kings but by councils of merchants, guildmasters, and citizens. Cities like Lübeck, Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and Augsburg thrived, their walls humming with trade, invention, and quiet defiance. Within them, gold spoke louder than noble blood. A baker could rise to magistrate, a blacksmith to councilman. Wealth was power, and trade was its language. Lübeck stood as the shining head of the Hanseatic League, a network of towns that stretched across the cold waters of the North and Baltic seas, its ships carrying salt, fish, timber, and secrets. Nuremberg became the empire's workshop, its forges crafting armor for knights and instruments for scholars. Frankfurt's fairs drew merchants from across Europe, where Venetian silk brushed shoulders with English wool. In these cities, ideas flowed as freely as coins. They became sanctuaries for thinkers and craftsmen fleeing feudal oppression, for Jews and foreigners seeking safety behind their gates. Their autonomy was a delicate thing granted by emperors who needed their wealth but feared their independence. Yet, the cities learned how to wield influence without wearing crowns. They funded emperors' campaigns, negotiated treaties, and lent money to kings. They were the veins through which the empire's lifeblood flowed. But freedom always comes at a cost. The cities were islands in a sea of feudal jealousy. Nobles despised their growing power, raiding their caravans and taxing their trade routes. Conflicts erupted, city militias against knightly armies, crossbows against banners. Still, the free cities endured, fortified by walls, wealth, and will. Their cathedrals rose like monuments to human ambition, adorned not for princes, but for the glory of craftsmanship itself. Within their guild halls, democracy flickered imperfect, narrow but alive in an age of divine right. The Holy Roman Empire may have been a mosaic of divided lands, but its pulse beat strongest in these bustling towns. Here, among the clang of hammers and the murmur of marketplaces, a new Germany was quietly being forged, one, not of emperors, but of people. The question was no longer who ruled the land, but who shaped its soul, while the free cities thrived in trade and autonomy. Another force carried the German banner far beyond the empire's borders, the Teutonic Order, born in the holy dust of Jerusalem during the Crusades. This brotherhood of warrior monks carried both sword and scripture, vowing to defend the faith and conquer the wilderness in Christ's name. But when the Crusader states in the Holy Land crumbled, their mission did not end, it simply shifted north. The Baltic shores called to them, lands of forests and pagan tribes untouched by Rome's gospel. There, the Teutonic Knights built a new crusade, carving castles of white stone into the frozen earth of Prussia and Livonia. They came with iron discipline, black crosses on their cloaks, and a belief that God had chosen them to civilize the frontier. Villages were burned, temples razed, and new cities rose from the ashes. Marienburg, Kingsburg, Riga Troch, a symbol of holy conquest and German ambition. The knights ruled not as conquerors, but as governors, blending monastic severity with military order. Under their banners, the German East expanded, blending cultures, languages, and faiths into something both brutal and lasting. But their zeal carried the seeds of their downfall. The pagans they subdued became restless subjects, and neighboring kingdoms, Poland and Lithuania, grew, wary of their growing power. In 1410, at the Battle of Grunwald, the proud order met its reckoning. The Teutonic army, once thought invincible, was crushed by a coalition of Polish and Lithuanian forces. The Grand Master fell, and with him the myth of divine invulnerability. The once mighty order retreated behind its walls, its faith dimmed, its empire fading. Yet even in defeat, the legacy endured. The lands they shaped Prussia above all would rise again in centuries to come as the beating core of a new German identity. The black cross of the Teutonic Knights would reappear on banners long after their order had turned to dust. They had sought to conquer souls, but in the end they had built nations. The empire looked east and saw its reflection in steel and fire, understanding at last that its destiny was not only within the mountains of Germany, but in the endless horizon beyond them. For centuries, the Holy Roman Empire lived in the long shadow of Rome, not the ancient one of Caesars, but the living one of the popes. The emperor wore his crown by divine right, or so he claimed, but the church held the keys to heaven, and those keys could open or close the gates of legitimacy. This uneasy balance between throne and altar defined the very soul of medieval Germany. The emperors needed the church's blessing to rule. The popes needed the emperor's armies to defend Christendom. Yet their alliance was poisoned by pride. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries had already scarred both sides, but the tension never truly died. Even after Frederick II's fall, popes continued to weave their influence into imperial politics, deciding which prince could rise and which king would kneel. In cathedrals and courts, debates raged over who ruled by God's will, the man in Rome or the man in Aachen. When emperors defied papal decrees, they were excommunicated. When they obeyed, they lost the loyalty of their nobles. This was not a rivalry of faith, but of control. Each side cloaked its ambition in sanctity. The Pope would call his enemies heretics. The emperor would accuse Rome of corruption. And amid their feud, the common people suffered. Their tithes drained to fill papal coffers, their fields taxed to fund imperial wars. The church's power was vast, yet increasingly hollow. Monasteries grew rich, bishops behaved like princes, and indulgences turned salvation into commerce. The empire's conscience began to stir. Scholars whispered that perhaps the divine right of kings was not divine at all. In the universities of Prague and Heidelberg, thinkers dared to question both crown and cross. This slow rebellion of the mind would one day become a fire that neither pope nor emperor could control. But for now, the illusion held the emperor would kneel before the pope to receive his crown, and the pope would raise him as the defender of Christendom, both pretending the other was not already plotting his downfall. It was a theatre of sanctity, a crown of shadows worn by men who claimed to rule in God's name while secretly serving their own. And though the audience watched in reverence, behind the curtain, faith and power were already drifting apart. By the early 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire stood vast but hollow, its glittering churches concealing rot beneath marble and gold. Indulgences were sold like wares, in a market coins buying salvation, forgiveness measured in silver. The peasants prayed while the princes schemed, and Rome grew rich on their faith. Then, in 1517, in the quiet university town of Wittenberg, a monk with weary eyes and a restless soul took up his hammer and struck history itself. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, not knowing the sound of that hammer would echo across the centuries. He did not call for rebellion. He called for truth. But truth, once spoken aloud, has a way of unraveling the world. Luther's words spread faster than any decree could stop. Carried by the new magic of the printing press small black letters that moved like fire across the continent. He questioned indulgences, the authority of the Pope, the wealth of the Church, and even the notion that salvation required any intermediary at all. The empire trembled. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a heretic. The common folk took his words as liberation. The princes saw them as an opportunity. If Rome could be defied, so could its taxes and decrees. Luther stood trial before Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms in 1521. Surrounded by power, he refused to recant, declaring, "Here I stand. I can do no other." It was not a cry of defiance, but of conscience. Excommunicated and outlawed, he went into hiding under the protection of sympathetic nobles, translating the Bible into German so that every farmer and widow could read it for themselves. The Reformation had begun not with armies, but with ink. Across Germany, churches split, monasteries emptied, and old faith turned into fury. The empire that once claimed to unite Christendom now cracked along invisible lines of belief. Brothers became enemies, villages divided by faith, and altars once shared became battlegrounds of the soul. What had started as a monk's protest had become a revolution of thought, and behind it lay a question that no crown or cross could answer if truth could belong to every man. Who then could claim to rule in God's name? The fire that Martin Luther had lit with words soon spread to the hands of those who had only ever known chains. Across Germany, the peasants long burdened by taxes, famine, and the cruelty of their lords began to believe that God himself had given them permission to rise. The Reformation's promise of spiritual freedom transformed into a cry for earthly justice. By 1524, the countryside was alive with rebellion. In the Black Forest, Swabia, and Franconia, thousands gathered beneath banners marked with the cross and the plough. They called themselves the children of God, demanding not gold or power, but the simple dignity to live free. Their 12 articles declared rights that echoed centuries ahead: fair rent, freedom from serfdom, and the right to choose their pastors. Yet, what began as hope turned swiftly to horror. Castles burned, abbeys were looted, and the lords answered with steel. The nobles saw not a cry for justice, but the unraveling of the divine order itself. Luther, horrified by the chaos, turned his pen against the rebels, urging princes to smite, slay, and stab those who defied their rulers. His words, once a banner of rebellion, became a weapon of suppression. The empire drowned in blood. At Frankenhausen in 1525, the peasants made their final stand-a-mass of farmers and labourers facing trained soldiers and cannon. The field ran red by nightfall. Tens of thousands lay dead. Their leader, Thomas Munzer, a preacher who believed he was chosen to bring about God's justice on earth, was captured and executed. The dream of a just Christian society died with him. The nobles triumphed, but the victory was hollow. The land was scarred, and so was faith itself. The people had seen how swiftly divine ideals could turn into human cruelty. The empire emerged from the rebellion not stronger, but more divided spiritually, socially, and morally. The Reformation continued, but its purity was lost in the smoke of burned villages and broken promises. Germany would never again be the same. The peasants had been crushed, but the idea that ordinary men could question power, whether of kings or priests, had taken root. It would sleep beneath the soil for centuries, waiting for another storm to wake it. After the flames of the Peasants' War died out, the empire entered a colder, more cunning phase of transformation. The question of faith had shifted from the fields to the courts, from the hands of the poor to the halls of the powerful. The German princes, those same electors and dukes who once bowed to both emperor and pope, now saw in Luther's rebellion not chaos, but opportunity. Religion became a banner beneath which politics marched. Some princes embraced Protestantism not out of conviction, but calculation. Breaking with Rome meant freedom from papal taxes and a chance to seize the vast wealth of monasteries and bishops. Others clung to Catholicism, seeing in it the last thread of unity holding the empire together. The Holy Roman Empire became a map of faith, divided into patchwork realms, choosing its own creed, each daring the emperor to intervene. Emperor Charles V, a man of vast dominion and sincere faith, found himself caught between his oath to defend Catholicism and his need to keep the empire intact. He waged wars against the Ottoman Turks in the east, against France in the west, and against rebellion within his own lands. But faith, unlike territory, could not be conquered. The Augsburg Confession of 1530 tried to bridge the divide, offering a statement of Protestant belief to the emperor in hopes of reconciliation. Instead, it drew the line deeper, formalizing what could no longer be undone. By the 1540s, war returned, this time not peasants against princes, but princes against emperor. The Schmalkaldic League, an alliance of Protestant states, took up arms against imperial authority, declaring that conscience could not be commanded. Cannon fire replaced scripture. Cities burned in the name of truth. The empire that once called itself holy and Roman now felt neither. When Charles V finally triumphed in 1547, it was a victory without peace. He forced the Protestant leaders to kneel, but their beliefs remained unbroken. A few years later, exhausted and disillusioned, he abdicated his throne and withdrew to a monastery, leaving behind an empire bleeding from its own divisions. The princes had won what the peasants never could, the right to rule both body and soul within their borders. The Reformation had begun as a cry for faith, but it had become a game of crowns, where salvation was measured not by grace, but by power. In 1555, the endless wars of faith finally gave way to a treaty that was less peace than exhaustion carved into parchment. The Peace of Augsburg was signed between the warring princes of the empire and Emperor Charles's successor, Ferdinand I. It sought to end the bloodshed by turning belief itself into law. Its principle was simple, yet fateful: cuius ias religio, whose realm, his religion. Each prince could now decide whether his lands would follow Catholicism or Lutheranism, and his subjects were bound to follow his choice or leave. It was a compromise born of necessity, a truce between conviction and survival. The Church's monopoly on truth was broken, yet freedom of faith remained an illusion. The peasants who had once bled for reform found themselves again under the authority of their lords, their souls dictated by the faith of their ruler. Still, for a time, it worked. The cannons fell silent, and the empire, weary from decades of spiritual and political warfare, began to rebuild. Cities reopened their markets, universities resumed their teaching, and the sound of bells once again carried across valleys that had known only smoke and mourning. But beneath that fragile calm, the seeds of future war were already sown. The treaty recognized only two forms of Christianity: Catholicism and Lutheranism, leaving out the rising Calvinists, Anabaptists, and other reformers who refused to fit neatly into either camp. These groups would grow restless in the shadows, challenging the peace that had excluded them. The emperor's authority, once thought divine, was now fractured beyond repair. Germany was no longer a single empire, but a collection of miniature sovereignties, each guarding its faith like treasure. Some princes ruled with tolerance. Others purged dissent with fire. The Reformation had been tamed, but its spirit had not been silenced. Philosophers began to speak quietly of conscience, of reason, of the idea that perhaps the soul belonged not to any crown or creed, but to itself. The Peace of Augsburg had ended one age of war, but created another kind of tension and empire, divided not by armies, but by belief. It was peace, yes, but a peace that trembled with every sermon, every edict, every whisper of reform. It was the stillness before the storm that would one day consume all of Europe, the storm called the 30 Years' War. As the 17th century dawned, the Holy Roman Empire stood like a vast and aging cathedral, magnificent from a distance, but within, its foundations cracked and its walls echoing with discord. The Peace of Augsburg had silenced the gunfire, but not the arguments, and the air across Germany grew thick with mistrust. Protestant and Catholic princes eyed one another across invisible borders, each fearing that the other would seize divine favor or military advantage. The emperors of the Habsburg dynasty, still clinging to dreams of a unified Catholic empire, began pressing for reforms that would strengthen imperial control and restore the faith of Rome. But the Protestant princes, emboldened by their newfound sovereignty, would not bend. In the towns and universities, whispers of Calvinism spread like smoke, fiery, elusive, and impossible to contain. The city of Heidelberg became a Protestant beacon, its scholars preaching a sharper, more intellectual faith that challenged both Lutheran orthodoxy and Catholic hierarchy. Meanwhile, in the imperial court of Prague, tensions simmered. Bohemia, restless and fiercely independent, had long resented Habsburg rule. Its nobles tolerated a Catholic monarch only so long as he respected their right to worship freely. But when Ferdinand of Styria, soon to be Emperor Ferdinand II, ascended the throne, his vision was absolute. He would cleanse his empire of heresy and restore the old order of the Church, no matter the cost. Bohemia became the spark waiting for a match. In 1618, that match was struck. Two imperial envoys arrived in Prague to enforce the emperor's decrees, and the Protestant nobles, pushed beyond endurance, hurled them from a castle window. The envoys miraculously survived the fall, but the Act de Defenestration of Prague echoed through all of Europe like a thunderclap. Within months, armies were on the move. The Bohemians declared independence under a Protestant king, Frederick of the Palatinate, while the Habsburgs summoned their allies for holy war. The 30 Years' War had begun not as a single conflict, but as a chain reaction of fear, pride, and faith gone mad. What started in Prague would soon engulf every corner of the empire, drawing in kings, mercenaries, and foreign powers who saw in Germany's chaos a chance to reshape the world. The age of swords and sermons had reached its terrible crescendo. Sit back and imagine Germany in the 1620s, a land fractured like stained glass, brilliant in its diversity but fragile and sharp along every edge. The 30 Years' War had erupted with a violence that seemed almost apocalyptic. Armies moved like restless shadows across forests and rivers, leaving devastation in their wake. Villages burned, churches crumbled, and the countryside echoed with the cries of displaced families. Soldiers, some mercenaries, some driven by faith, others simply by hunger fought, not only for kings or emperors, but for survival, and for reasons that often blurred into chaos. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 had crushed the Bohemian rebels, sending Frederick's dream into exile and marking the beginning of Habsburg dominance. But the victory was Pyrrhic. For every stronghold the emperor captured, 100 villages lay in ruins, their fields scorched, their rivers swollen with the blood of men and animals alike. Starvation stalked the land, and disease followed where armies tread. Pestilence, smallpox, and typhus moved alongside soldiers like unseen generals, claiming more lives than any sword. Some historians suggest that up to a third of the population perished in certain regions, leaving entire towns abandoned and forests creeping over what had once been farmland. Cities became fortresses, marketplaces silent, and cathedrals shelters for those desperate enough to seek refuge among sacred walls. Yet even amidst this destruction, commerce, diplomacy, and espionage continued. Merchants seeking to profit, ambassadors navigating the deadly currents of European politics, and spies slipping through war-torn villages to carry secrets that could topple kingdoms. Foreign powers, from Sweden to France, smelled opportunity and entered the conflict, turning a German civil war into a continent-wide struggle. The land itself seemed to mourn. The forests grew dark and unkempt, the rivers thick with sediment and debris, and the winds carrying whispers of suffering from one valley to the next. Yet in this chaos, some communities adapted, finding ways to survive, hide, and even thrive amidst uncertainty. It was a world where survival was strategy, faith could be both weapon and refuge, and every decision might be the difference between life and death. And as the war dragged on, stretching decades into relentless winters and scorching summers, the question lingered in the minds of all who witnessed it. Would Germany ever heal from these flames? Or had the empire been irrevocably altered, its people and landscapes scarred for generations? From the ashes of despair, the next chapter of the German story would emerge, one that no one alive at the time could fully imagine. As the echoes of cannon fire faded and smoke drifted from burned villages, Germany began to awaken to a new reality. A landscape reshaped not only by war but by centuries of layered history, human ambition, and relentless change. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 marked the official end of the 30 Years' War, yet its effects rippled far beyond the signing of parchment, altering borders, faiths, and the very notion of political authority. Imagine standing on the banks of the Rhine, or in a once thriving village, now half abandoned, hearing the distant toll of a church bell, signaling a fragile attempt to return to normalcy. Sovereigns, once all-powerful in theory, now had to negotiate, compromise, and recognize the autonomy of local rulers. The old medieval hierarchies had fractured, leaving room for the emergence of territorial principalities and modern statecraft. Economies, ravaged by decades of conflict, began the slow process of recovery. Fields were cleared, trade routes cautiously reopened, and artisans returned to cities that had not been entirely consumed by flames. The cultural and intellectual life of Germany, too, shifted. Universities, monasteries, and workshops that had survived served as hubs for rebuilding knowledge, arts, and skills, while printing presses began to circulate not only religious texts but treatises on law, science, and philosophy, planting the seeds of enlightenment and inquiry that would blossom in the coming centuries. Across the land, communities grappled with memory and loss, preserving tales of heroism, tragedy, and survival, while legends of crusading knights, peasant revolts, and mercenary armies became intertwined with the daily rhythms of rebuilding lives. Some researchers suggest that this period of reconstruction forged a resilient German identity, one that balanced local traditions with an emerging awareness of a shared history shaped by conflict, diplomacy, and the persistent interplay between power and culture. Others argue that the scars left by war created deep fissures, socially and politically, that would echo through subsequent generations, influencing religious divides, economic policies, and the very strategies of governance that rulers employed. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the subtle murmurs of change. The hum of a blacksmith's hammer in a newly rebuilt town, the creak of a ship's mast along the Baltic coast, the distant chant of scholars debating in cloisters. It is a Germany both haunted and hopeful, where the medieval past collides with the possibilities of a more structured, interconnected future. And as you drift toward sleep, imagine the endless flow of rivers carrying stories from one region to another. The forests that survived centuries of human ambition whispering their secrets, and the cities slowly rising from ashes, waiting to witness the dawn of early modern Europe. The medieval world has ended, but the echoes linger, shaping the rhythm, the memory, and the soul of a land poised on the brink of transformation, leaving us to wonder what lessons from this age of knights, emperors, and fire will resonate in the centuries yet to come.